The red planet hung in the dark sky like a drop of blood. Captain Teo pressed her face against the small window of the survey vessel and watched the world grow larger and larger. She had been traveling in space for 6 months, studying the outer territories of the Krell Dominion. The mission was simple: gather data, take measurements, and return home safely. But nothing ever went according to plan. The ship shook violently. Alarms screamed through the corridors like wounded animals. Teo gripped the edge of the window as another explosion rocked the vessel. In the engine room below, something had failed. Something had broken. The advanced technology that had carried humanity across the stars was now failing, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. "Captain, the engines are overloading." Engineer Junshik's voice crackled through the communication system. He sounded afraid. Teo had known Junshik for 5 years, and she had never heard him sound afraid before. "Get everyone to the escape pods," Teo ordered. She was already running toward the main deck, her boots echoing on the metal floor. Around her, the ship continued to shake and groan. Lights flickered and died. The temperature began to rise as the engines lost control. Teo reached the main deck to find chaos. Her crew of 12 people were moving in different directions, confused and scared. Some were heading toward the escape pods. Others were trying to save equipment and important data. Medic Da Young was helping an injured technician toward the nearest exit. "Go!" Teo shouted. "Everyone to the pods! Now!" The crew moved faster. Within minutes, they were packed into the small escape pods. Teo counted heads as they strapped themselves in. 12 people. All present. The pods ejected from the dying ship with a sound like crying, and the vessel fell toward the red planet like a falling star. Teo's pod shook and trembled as it entered the atmosphere. The heat outside was so intense that the window glowed red. She closed her eyes and held tight to the safety straps. Around her, the other crew members held their breath. This was the most dangerous part of the journey re-entry. Many people did not survive re-entry. The pod struck the ground with tremendous force. Teo felt the impact in every bone of her body. Then everything went quiet. Smoke filled the small cabin. Alarms stopped screaming. There was only silence and the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. Slowly, Teo unbuckled her safety straps and pushed open the emergency hatch. Fresh air rushed in, cold and strange. Unlike anything on Earth, she stepped out onto the surface of Zareth 7 and saw her crew emerging from their pods all around her. They were alive. Against all odds, they had survived the crash, but they were on an alien world, surrounded by thick red forests and strange purple vegetation. The sky was orange, not blue. The air tasted metallic on her tongue, and in the distance, Teo could hear something that made her blood run cold. "What was that?" Da Young asked, moving closer to Teo. "I don't know," Teo replied. "But we need to take shelter. Help me organize the supplies." The crew gathered what they could salvage from the damaged escape pods. Water containers, emergency food rations, basic medical supplies, and communication equipment. The radio was broken, which meant they could not call for help. They were alone on this strange world until rescue came. If rescue came at all. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of green and purple, Teo led her crew to a small clearing near a cliff. It was defensible, with good sightlines to the forest in all directions. They set up a temporary camp, arranged supplies, and prepared to survive their first night on an alien world. But Teo could not sleep. She sat at the edge of the camp, looking out into the darkness. The jungle was full of sounds, strange calls, and movements in the undergrowth. She thought about the rescue ship that might be looking for them, the family she had left behind on Earth, and the terrible distance between her and home. It was during the second day that Teo decided to explore beyond the camp. Junshik tried to stop her, saying it was too dangerous. But supplies were limited, and they needed to find water sources and perhaps some kind of food. So, Teo took a knife, a small bag, and ventured into the purple forest alone. The jungle was dense and difficult to walk through. Thick vines hung from the tall trees, like the arms of ancient creatures. The ground was soft and spongy, covered with a strange red moss. Teo moved carefully, watching for any sign of danger. She had studied the Krell Dominion before the mission. She knew that this world was home to the Krell, massive predators that stood twice as tall as humans and had teeth as long as fingers. The Krell were said to be territorial, aggressive, and deadly. No human had ever successfully made contact with them. After walking for nearly an hour, Teo heard a sound, a whimpering, like a young animal in pain. She followed the sound and found herself at the edge of a ravine. Below, wedged between two large rocks, was a creature. It had scales that shimmered like emerald glass, and eyes that were bright yellow and filled with fear. It was a hatchling, a young Krell. Nearby, Teo found the body of an adult Krell. It was dead, killed by other predators, its massive body already beginning to decay in the hot sun. The hatchling must have been trapped when it fell, unable to climb back up to the jungle above. It must have been there for days. Slowly, starving, Teo's mind raced. She had been warned her entire life about the Krell. They were monsters. They were killers. They would destroy her without hesitation. But looking at the trapped hatchling, hearing its small sounds of desperation, Teo saw something different. She saw a child. She saw something innocent and scared. Without thinking too much about what she was doing, Teo climbed down into the ravine. The rocks were sharp and cut her hands as she descended. The hatchling noticed her and let out a sharp cry of alarm. It tried to move away, but it was trapped by the fallen rocks. It could only watch as Teo came closer and closer. "It is okay," Teo said softly, speaking in a gentle voice, even though she knew the creature could not understand her words. "It is okay. I will help you." Working carefully, Teo moved the smaller rocks away from the hatchling. Some were very heavy, and she had to use all her strength. The hatchling watched her with its yellow eyes, fear and confusion mixing in its expression. Finally, the largest rock rolled away, and the hatchling was free. It stood on shaky legs, its small body trembling. It was almost her size, but so thin that Teo could see its ribs. It had not eaten in many days. The hatchling looked at Teo, and in that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. She decided to take the creature back to camp. She decided to try to keep it alive. She did not know what the others would say. She did not know if it was a good idea or a terrible mistake. But as she looked into those yellow eyes, Teo could not walk away. She could not leave a child to die, even if that child was a Krell. Teo led the hatchling back through the jungle toward the camp. The creature followed her without protest, its small claws clicking against the hard ground. She had torn strips from her jacket to create a simple leash, but she did not need to use it. The hatchling seemed to understand that Teo was helping it, that she was not a threat, or perhaps it was simply too weak and hungry to resist. As they walked, Teo thought about what she would say to her crew. She knew what they would think. She knew what they would say. A Krell was a predator, a monster, a killer. Keeping one alive was insane. It was suicide. But Teo had made her choice, and she was going to stick to it. When she arrived at the camp with the hatchling beside her, the reaction was immediate and angry. Junshik jumped to his feet, his hand moving toward a weapon. Da Young gasped in shock. The other crew members stepped back, their faces showing fear and confusion. "What have you done?" Junshik demanded. "Captain, are you out of your mind? That is a Krell. It will kill us all." "It is a child," Teo said quietly. "It is starving and orphaned. I am not going to let it die. It will grow into a monster." Another crew member shouted. "We should kill it now while it is small." Teo shook her head firmly. She put herself between her crew and the hatchling. "No one is going to harm this creature. That is an order. For a moment, tension filled the camp. Teo could see the anger in her crew's eyes. But she was still the captain. And they were still her crew. After a moment, Junshik lowered his hand and turned away in disgust. "You are making a mistake," he said. "This will end badly for all of us." Monzun, Da Young, however, approached the hatchling carefully. She studied it with a medical eye, checking for injuries and signs of illness. "It is severely malnourished," she reported. "Dehydrated as well. If we do not get food and water into this creature soon, it will die." "Floth. Then let us start feeding it," Teo said. She gave the hatchling some of their emergency water rations in a metal container. The creature drank desperately, its throat moving quickly as it swallowed. Then, she gave it some of the dried food supplies. The hatchling ate it all, without hesitation. That first night was difficult. The other crew members stayed far away from the hatchling, refusing to get close to it. Only Teo and Da Young attended to its needs. The hatchling was confused and frightened, and it made strange sounds throughout the night. But it did not try to harm anyone. It seemed to understand that Teo was taking care of it. Days passed, and the hatchling began to recover. Its scales, which had been dull and faded, began to shine. Its eyes became brighter and more alert. It started to move around the camp, exploring and sniffing at everything. Teo gave it a name, Vex, because of the way it moved, quick and sharp like the word itself. Vex began to follow Teo everywhere. When she walked, it walked behind her. When she sat, it sat nearby. The creature made quiet chirping sounds when she was close, sounds that seemed to express contentment. At night, Vex would curl up near Teo's sleeping area, as close as it could get without touching her. The other crew members watched this bond form with growing discomfort. Junshik continued to argue that keeping the hatchling was a mistake. He spoke to Teo privately, trying to convince her to change her mind. But Teo was determined. She saw something in Vex that the others could not see: intelligence, emotion, and a capacity for loyalty. Weeks passed. The crew had established a more permanent camp near a freshwater stream. Teo had created a hunting schedule, and she would spend hours in the jungle searching for food. She learned to identify which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous. She learned to trap small animals and birds. Every bit of food she could find, she shared with Vex. She was using more than half of her own rations to feed the growing hatchling, but she did not care. One day, while Teo was away from the camp hunting, something happened that changed everything. A large predator, not a krell, but something else entirely, something even more dangerous, approached the camp. The creature had scales like metal and teeth that could tear through rock. It was hunting for food. Vex was in the camp, resting near the supply tents. When the predator appeared at the edge of the forest, the other crew members froze in terror. This was a true monster, far more fearsome than the young krell hatchling. They had no weapons that could hurt such a creature. They prepared to run, but Vex did not run. The hatchling stood up, its scales suddenly brightening with color. It let out a roar, small and not fully developed, but full of defiance and protective fury. The creature moved toward the predator, placing itself between the monster and the camp. The predator was confused by this small krell challenging it. For a moment, it hesitated, and that hesitation was enough. Vex roared again, louder this time, a sound that carried across the jungle. The predator decided that this small krell was not worth the effort and turned away into the forest, seeking easier prey elsewhere. Vex returned to the camp, its body shaking slightly from the effort. It went directly to Teo's tent and lay down inside, waiting for her to return. When Teo arrived back at the camp that evening, she heard the story from Da Young. She learned how Vex had protected them all. She realized that the bond she had created with the hatchling was far deeper than she had known. The creature was genuinely loyal to her, willing to face danger to keep her safe. That night, Teo sat with Vex and stroked its scales gently. The hatchling made soft, purring sounds, and its yellow eyes closed in contentment. Teo realized something important. She was no longer just keeping Vex alive. Vex was keeping her alive. The relationship had become mutual. From that day forward, even Junshik stopped complaining about the hatchling. He could see that Vex was not a monster. He was a companion, a friend, a protector. The crew began to accept the creature as part of their group. They began to understand what Teo had understood from the beginning, that compassion and kindness could cross the boundaries between species. That love could exist between creatures that should have been enemies. Every day, Vex grew stronger. Every day, the bond between the hatchling and Teo grew deeper, and neither of them knew that this bond would soon change the entire galaxy. 4 months after the crash, the jungle had become familiar to Teo and her crew. They had established routines. They had found sources of food and water. They had learned to live on Zereth 7, adapting to its strange weather and dangerous creatures. Vex had grown significantly larger, though he was still small for a young Krell. His scales now bore patterns of deep blue and emerald green, beautiful in a way that made even Junshik occasionally stare at him with something like wonder. The rescue signal had been sent regularly from their emergency communications device, but they received no response. The equipment was old and might not work properly in this part of space, or perhaps rescue was still many months away. Teo had learned to stop thinking too much about rescue. She had learned to focus on survival. But things were about to change in a way that no one could have predicted. It began with a sound in the distance, a deep, resonant calling that made the very ground shake. It was different from the sounds that Vex made. It was louder, more powerful, and it carried meaning that Vex seemed to understand. The young hatchling's scales suddenly brightened with color, and he became agitated. He paced back and forth, making answering calls in his own voice. "What is happening?" Da Young asked, concerned. Teo felt a chill run down her spine. She knew what this sound meant. The calling was a territorial marker, a signal that other Krell were nearby. And they were coming toward the camp. "Everyone inside the shelters," she ordered. Now, the crew obeyed quickly. They had learned to respond to Teo's commands without question. Within minutes, everyone except Teo was inside the protected tents. Vex, however, remained outside with her. The young Krell stood rigid, his body tense and ready for conflict. "Stay calm," Teo whispered to him, placing her hand on his scaled shoulder. "Whatever happens, stay calm." They did not have to wait long. From the dense forest, figures began to emerge. At first, there were 3 of them, then 5, then 10. They were Krell massive, scaled creatures with bodies that glistened under the alien sun. They were far larger than Vex, with deeper colors in their scales, and patterns that seemed to indicate rank and power. These were adults, warriors, predators in their full maturity, and leading them was something even more impressive. A Krell who was taller than all the others, whose scales were a deep crimson color that seemed to glow with inner light. This was Lord Cathor, an alpha of the highest order. His presence alone commanded respect and fear. Teo could feel the power radiating from him, a force that seemed to bend the air around him. Cathor looked down at Teo with eyes like molten gold. His massive jaw opened, revealing teeth that were each as long as her hand. When he spoke, his voice was like distant thunder, deep and resonant. "Why do you hold our young?" he demanded. His voice was so powerful that Teo had to brace herself against the sound. Why does a human dare to possess what belongs to the Krell? Teo's heart was racing, but she forced herself to speak with a steady voice. This young one was orphaned. It was trapped and starving. I found it and brought it back to health. That is all. "You lie," one of the other Krell hissed. "No human would care for a Krell. This is a trick. This is some kind of trap." But Cathor raised one massive clawed hand, silencing his companions. He studied Teo with an expression that was difficult to read. Teo could sense that this Krell was intelligent, thoughtful, more complex than she had expected. She could sense that he was trying to understand what he was seeing. "What is the name of this young one?" Kathor asked. "Vex," Teo replied simply. Kaithor turned his attention to Vex. The young hatchling stood between Teo and the Alpha, his body shaking slightly. It was clear that Vex recognized Kaithor as a superior, someone of greater power and status. The natural instinct would be to submit, to bow, to acknowledge the hierarchy. But Vex did not move away from Teo. He did not submit. Instead, he raised his head and looked directly at Kaithor. The young Krell's scales brightened with defiant colors, purples and blues that seemed to shimmer with courage. "So," Kaithor said slowly, "the young one has chosen. Interesting." "Oh." The Alpha took a step forward. His massive claws clicked against the ground. The Krell warriors behind him tensed, preparing for violence. Teo knew that this was the moment when everything could go wrong. This was the moment when they could all die. But she refused to back down. She refused to show fear, even though her heart was pounding like a drum inside her chest. She placed her small human hand on Vex's scaled back, a gesture of trust and solidarity. Kaithor watched this gesture carefully. His massive body was still, frozen in a moment that seemed to stretch into infinity. The entire jungle held its breath. The sounds of insects and animals faded away. There was only the breathing of the Krell, the heartbeat of the humans, and the whisper of wind through the trees. Then, something changed in Kaithor's expression. His aggressive posture relaxed slightly. His jaw closed. His golden eyes seemed to look at Teo with understanding rather than threat. "You have given this young one your own protection," Kaithor said finally. "You have used your own resources to keep it alive. You have faced danger to defend it. You have done this even though you were afraid, even though you knew we would come. Why would you do this?" Teo took a breath. She knew that her answer could determine whether they lived or died. "Because a child is a child," she said simply. "A child needs care. A child needs protection. I did not care what species it was. That did not matter to me. What mattered was that it was alive, and it needed help. That was enough." Kaithor was silent for a long moment. The other Krell warriors exchanged looks, confused by their leader's lack of aggression. The Alpha seemed to be thinking, processing something that challenged everything he understood about humans, about predators and prey, about the nature of strength and power itself. Finally, Kaithor lowered his massive head. One by one, the Krell warriors behind him did the same. It was a gesture of respect, a sign of submission and acknowledgement of strength, a gesture rarely seen among the proud Krell species. "You are strong," Kaithor said. "Stronger than we knew humans could be. You possess a courage that comes from a place deeper than any warrior's fury. You have shown us something we had forgotten." Number 9. Weekend 41-52R4. Weekend 41-5 line. "I'm seeing 41. He looked at Vex, then back at Teo. "We will not take the young one from you. The bond that you have created is true and real. That bond cannot be broken, nor should it be. We will leave you in peace." With that, Kaithor turned and began to walk away. His warriors followed him into the forest, disappearing as quietly as they had come. But something fundamental had changed in that moment. The Krell had looked upon humanity and had recognized something they had never expected to find, not weakness, but a different kind of strength. A strength that came not from claws and teeth, but from compassion and loyalty. 3 weeks after Kaithor's visit to the camp, something unexpected happened. A shuttle landed in the clearing near the human settlement. The doors opened, and humans stepped out, rescue personnel, finally arrived to save the crew of the crashed survey vessel. They were shocked to find the camp in good condition, and the crew alive and relatively healthy. They were even more shocked to discover that the crew had been living peacefully with a young Krell hatchling. Commander Park from the rescue ship studied Vex carefully, his hand on the weapon at his side. "Is this creature dangerous?" he asked Teo. No, Teo replied firmly. Vex is not dangerous. He is our companion. And he is coming with us. There was an argument about this. Commander Park tried to convince Teo that bringing a Krell back to human space was too risky, too unpredictable. But Teo refused to leave Vex behind. She had kept the hatchling alive for months. She had created a bond with him that ran deeper than anything she had experienced before. She was not going to abandon him now. Finally, Commander Park gave in, though he made it clear that this decision would have to be reported to the highest levels of human government. Teo, her crew, and Vex boarded the rescue ship and ascended into the sky, leaving Zareth 7 behind. The journey back to human space took several weeks. Vex had never been in a ship before, and he found the experience strange and frightening. There were no open skies, no jungle smells, only the artificial environment of a spacecraft. But Teo stayed with him constantly, soothing him, helping him adapt. She showed him the stars through the viewport and explained, in her gentle way, that they were traveling home. When they finally reached Earth, the entire galaxy seemed to know about them. News of the human who had saved a Krell hatchling had spread far and wide. The story challenged everything that both humans and Krell believed about each other. It suggested that perhaps the two species did not have to be enemies. Perhaps they could coexist, could even be friends. The human government brought Teo and Vex to the capital city. They were placed in a special facility, studied by scientists and diplomats, questioned about every detail of their experience on Zareth 7. But they also became symbols of something new, the possibility of peace between species that had been destined, it seemed, to be eternal enemies. It was during these meetings that Teo first encountered Dr. Hae-won and Administrator Min-kun. They were representatives of the human government, tasked with deciding what would be done with Vex and how this situation should be handled. Unlike many others, they did not view Vex as a threat or a curiosity. They viewed him as a potential bridge between two civilizations. If we can prove that humans and Krell can live together peacefully, without violence or conflict, it could change everything, Dr. Hae-won said during one of their conversations. It could open doors to trade, to shared knowledge, to a future where both species benefit from cooperation instead of being locked in eternal conflict. But it will be difficult, Administrator Min-kun added. The Krell have their own culture, their own hierarchy, their own ways of understanding the universe. We will have to learn to communicate with them, to understand them. It will require patience and wisdom from both sides. Teo nodded. She understood the weight of what was being asked of her. She and Vex had become more than just a human and a Krell living together. They had become symbols of a new possibility. They had become proof that the impossible could happen. Months passed. Diplomatic channels were opened between human space and the Krell Dominion. Messages were sent to Lord Kaethor, informing him that his people's young one was alive and safe among humans, that the human who had saved him was willing to return him if the Krell so desired. But more importantly, the humans proposed something revolutionary: formal negotiations for peace and trade between the two species. Kaethor's response was unexpected. Instead of demanding the return of Vex, the Alpha agreed to send a delegation of Krell diplomats to human space. More than that, he agreed to come himself, to meet with human leaders, and to discuss the possibility of a new relationship between their two civilizations. The day that Kaethor arrived at the human capital, crowds of people lined the streets. They had never seen a Krell before, never witnessed one of the legendary monsters that had haunted their nightmares for generations. They saw a creature that was massive and powerful, yes, but also intelligent and dignified. They saw not a monster, but a being capable of understanding, capable of wisdom, capable of respect. When Kaethor was brought to the chamber where Teo and Vex were waiting, something remarkable happened. The great Alpha approached them slowly, his golden eyes fixed on Vex. The young Krell stood up, his scales brightening with happiness at seeing a member of his own kind. But it was Teo that Kaethor bowed to first, lowering his great head in a gesture of profound respect. You have done something remarkable, Kythor said, his voice echoing through the chamber. You have shown my people that strength exists in forms we did not recognize. You have shown that the weak can be strong, that the small can be mighty, that compassion is not a weakness, but the greatest power of all. For this, humanity has earned the respect of the Krell. Teo felt tears in her eyes. She reached out and placed her hand on Kythor's scaled forehead, a gesture of affection and understanding. Thank you, she said simply. Thank you for understanding. In that moment, standing between a human and a Krell, understanding something that transcended language and species and evolution itself, Teo realized that everything had changed. The galaxy would never be the same. The future that humanity and the Krell would share would be determined not by weapons or conquest, but by this moment, by this understanding, by the love that had been born on a distant jungle world when one human decided to feed an orphaned hatchling. Years passed, and the Zareth Accord became the most important treaty in the known galaxy. Humans and Krell established trade routes, shared scientific knowledge, and built cultural exchanges that benefited both civilizations. The prophecy of inevitable conflict between the species had been replaced by a reality of cooperation and mutual respect. And, at the heart of this transformation, was the story of Teo and Vex. Teo became a legendary figure in both human and Krell society. She was invited to speak at universities and government institutions. She received medals and honors, but she never forgot that everything had begun with a simple act, seeing a hungry child and choosing to help, without thinking about the consequences, without worrying about the risks. She had done it not to change the galaxy, but because it was the right thing to do. Vex grew to his full adult size, becoming a magnificent Krell with scales of deep blue and emerald green. But he never lost his connection to Teo. He remained at her side, a living symbol of the bridge between species. Together, they traveled to both human worlds and Krell territories, telling their story, answering questions, helping people on both sides understand that differences did not have to lead to conflict. One day, Teo visited a school on the human world of New Sol. The classroom was filled with young children, all of them wide-eyed with wonder as she told them the story of the jungle, the crash, and the orphaned hatchling. She told them about the moment she found Vex trapped and starving, about her decision to save him, about the fear she felt when Kythor and his warriors arrived. "Why did you help the alien creature, Captain?" one young girl asked. "Were you not afraid?" Teo smiled. "Yes, I was afraid. Very afraid. But I was more moved by compassion than by fear. I saw a child that needed help, and I could not walk away. Fear is a natural thing, but compassion is stronger. When you see someone suffering, someone who needs help, compassion will always be more powerful than fear if you let it." At the same time, on a Krell world, another gathering was taking place. Young Krell hatchlings were being taught about the human female, who had shown their species a new way of understanding strength and power. They were told about Teo, with the same reverence that humans spoke about great heroes and legends. "Strength is not only in our claws and teeth," an elder Krell teacher explained to the young ones. "The humans showed us that strength can also exist in loyalty, in compassion, in the willingness to care for one who needs care. She was small and weak by our standards, yet she was the strongest among all of us because she understood something we had forgotten, that the greatest power comes from the heart." The years brought other changes as well. Junshik, the engineer who had been so opposed to keeping Vex, eventually became one of the most important figures in human-Krell cooperation. He worked with Krell engineers to study their technology, to understand how their ships worked, to learn from their advanced knowledge. He often spoke about how watching Teo care for Vex had changed his understanding of what it meant to be brave and wise. Da Young, the medic, became the first human to study Krell biology and medicine in depth. She traveled to Krell worlds to learn their healing methods and taught human medicine to Krell students. Her work saved countless lives on both sides when a great plague threatened to devastate the galaxy. She often credited Vex as being the first Krell patient she ever treated with care and compassion. But perhaps the most important development was what happened to Kaethor himself. The Great Alpha became a powerful voice for peace and understanding among the Krell. He traveled to other Krell territories, telling the story of Teo, explaining to his own people how the understanding of compassion had enriched their civilization. Under his leadership, the Krell began to see themselves not as the supreme predators who ruled through fear, but as part of a greater galaxy where many species could live together in harmony. 10 years after the Zareth Accord was signed, a great celebration was held on a neutral space station. Teo, now much older but still strong and vibrant, stood before an assembly of thousands, humans and Krell, and representatives from several other species who had been inspired by the story. She stood with Vex at her side, the adult Krell placing his massive head gently against her shoulder in a gesture of affection that would have seemed impossible just a decade before. "I am asked often if I knew what I was doing when I saved that young hatchling," Teo said, her voice carrying through the chamber. "The truth is that I did not know. I did not know that it would change the galaxy. I did not know that it would lead to peace between species. I did not know any of that. I only knew that there was a child who needed help, and I could not turn away. That was all." That simple act of compassion was enough. She paused, looking out at the faces before her, human faces and Krell faces, all listening intently to her words. "Perhaps that is the lesson we should all learn," she continued. "We do not need to understand all the consequences of our actions. We do not need to know how our compassion will ripple outward and change the world. We only need to see someone who needs help and have the courage to offer it. The universe takes care of the rest. Kindness has a power that we can never fully predict or control. Kindness is the greatest strength that any species can possess." When Teo finished speaking, the entire assembly stood up. Thousands of voices, human and Krell, joined together in a sound of respect and appreciation. Some were shouting, some were making Krell vocalizations. But all were expressing the same emotion: gratitude for one woman's choice, made so many years ago on a jungle world, to save an orphaned hatchling. Later that night, Teo sat alone with Vex in a quiet garden. She stroked his scales gently, feeling the familiar warmth of his body beside her. Vex made soft purring sounds, sounds that expressed contentment and happiness. They did not need to speak to each other anymore. After all these years, they understood each other perfectly. "Do you remember?" Teo asked softly. "Do you remember the ravine where I found you?" Vex turned his head and looked at Teo with those same yellow eyes, now older and deeper with experience and wisdom. He made a sound, a combination of chirps and rumbles that Teo had learned to understand perfectly. It meant, "Yes, I remember. I remember everything. I remember that you saved me, and I will be grateful for the rest of my life." Teo smiled. "We saved each other," she said. "You did not know it then, but you were saving me just as much as I was saving you." In the distance, the lights of the space station twinkled like stars. All across the galaxy, humans and Krell were working together, trading together, learning together, living together. The impossible had become possible. The eternal enemies had become friends, and it had all begun because one human chose compassion over fear, kindness over indifference. On a day so long ago, when the jungle was quiet, and an orphaned hatchling needed someone to believe in it, the galaxy had changed. The Krell had bowed not to human strength or human weapons, but to human compassion, and in that bowing, they had found something far more valuable than conquest or dominance. They had found respect, understanding, and the beginning of a future where all beings could live together in peace.